For the musher, the most difficult aspect is the lack of sleep. And it is an ongoing and constant thing that you are aware of. We are getting between 1 and 2 hours of sleep a day for perhaps 11 to 13, 14-day race. It turns out a little bit more than that. I think in a 12-day race, I'll get about 20 hours of sleep. And most people think that fact in itself would make this an extremely grueling, totally uncomfortable race. Then you add to it the cold. We are often as cold as 50 below. You have the windstorms, you have the snowstorms. You also might have 40 above zero. You have a lot of elements that are causing what most people view as discomfort. But again, the thing to remember is that we live in that all year round. And although, yes, I am very, very cold at 50 below, and even as good as I have learned to dress in those temperatures, I'm not going to say I'm completely comfortable. Yet, I know how to deal with them, and I'm not miserable. Although sometimes you are, but I'm often not miserable. So the thing that I think is important for me to say is that the country we're going through is so magnificent and beautiful. And even though I've gone through this same country many, many, many times, it is never anything less than spectacular. And it is always changing. Every 20, 30, or 40 miles, you've come into a totally new terrain. Maybe you're in some really tall mountains, the Alaska range or one of the other ranges we go over. You could be on the Yukon River, which is at some points a mile across and just magnificent. Or the frozen tundra, which is not beautiful in the same sense of the mountains, but awesome in its expanse. So there's always something beautiful to look at. If it's the night, you may not be able to see anything except for the stars, or more often the northern lights. So we're always out in the spectacular nature and the wilderness. And no matter how tired you are, no matter how cold you are able to appreciate that. But I think most important is that you are out there with your 12, 16, 20 best friends, the dogs. And to see this group of dogs that, as in my case, because I raise all my own, I have raised each one of them. I have trained them. I know each little personality. I know what they're thinking as they're going down the trail, each individually. They're all thinking different thoughts. I know how much they're enjoying it. And I can see the work that we have accumulatively put together to make this team perform the way it is obviously performing for me if I'm being able to win is so satisfying and fantastic. To me, today, there is nothing that brings me more joy than to see a 16-dog team trotting down the trail with just as much power as you could muster. It's just a beautiful scene to me. Many people say, well, what do you think about for 12 days? Well, you are constantly, at every step of the way, if you are mushing the team, you are constantly worrying about steering the sled, making sure that the dogs are going the direction that you want them to, staying on the trail, so on and so forth. The trails are not cute, beautiful paths. We go over boulders, over fallen trees, over bare ground, twists and turns, and down through mountain gorges and over glare ice, through open water, everything. So it is physically demanding of the hand-eye, foot-eye contact to the actual steering of the sled for the musher to be doing. In addition, you're trying to watch your sled, what's going on in front of the sled 2 or 3 feet in front of it so you can watch. But then you have to be looking at your lead dogs way up there and every dog in the team, making sure that they are okay, taking the bends correctly, that there's no problems. So that's really what you're spending your time thinking about when you're mushing down the trail. In addition, you're constantly checking each dog. How is each individual dog performing? Is one tiring before the rest of the group? If so, it's time to stop. You always stop for the weakest dog, not the strongest dog. So when should I stop next? What should I feed them next? When is the next checkpoint? Trying to look at the terrain around you, trying to figure out where you are. I have a map, a compass, constantly checking my watch, trying to find out if I am lost or if I'm on the right trail. All these things are a great concern every moment of every day. In addition, you're in a race. You're not just on a survival trip. So you're worrying about where so-and-so is. Perhaps you just passed a fellow musher, stopped by the trail. Is he going to stop for a half hour? Is he going to stop for 4 hours? What does this mean to my strategy? When did I last see him? Let's see, he left the checkpoint a little bit in front of me. Am I moving faster than him? All these types of things. Or perhaps you literally pass somebody on the go. Well, that's a wonderful feeling, and you say, aha, I'm faster. Or at this point in the race, I'm faster. So it's a great game of strategies. It's a great game of dog care. Very much like the marathons, but of course it goes much longer, this game of cat and mouse. Do you want to be out in the lead? How much faster are you than another one? When should you take your rest periods and when should you push? This is great. But then you have the storms and you have everything else that comes in to create havoc with what would be a perfect strategy. So it's a balance between a survival act and a typical race. And so there are so many aspects of it. I think this is why it's held my interest for so long, is that there's always new things to get better at. Right now I'm spending a lot of my time working on canine nutrition, on canine sports medicine, on areas of that. I'm actually getting back into the veterinary field because I love it so much, to find out where I can enhance the team. But again, what I'm looking for is not written in any book. I'm working with veterinarians on the next step that they don't even know about, and it's really exciting. There are a lot of dangers. We have avalanches. We have just the dangers of the Arctic blizzards are in many ways the most fearsome. Many people freeze to death every year who travel in those countries. No one has ever froze to death on the race, but this happens typically with the local people. So we know it's extremely dangerous. The open water is perhaps the thing we fear the most, or the thin ice. In 1984, I can tell a story of being 10 miles away from a checkpoint village, an Eskimo village of Shaktoolik. And I was traveling along at night and traveling on some saltwater ice. And I was quite a ways off land. And all of a sudden I realized that the ice was billowing around me. And so just as I realized how dangerous it was, I gave the dogs the command to turn towards land just as my sled broke through. So I went under, broke through. The successive dogs right in front of the sled broke through because of the weight of my sled. But the lead dogs and a couple pairs behind them were able to stay up on the hard ice and slowly but surely pull the rest of us out. It was probably about 30 below, and there is not one blade of grass out there. There is nothing to start a fire with, to warm us up or dry us off. And so I just kept everybody moving. I ran for the next 10 miles to keep myself from freezing to get to the next checkpoint. Now, this water that I broke through was deep enough to drown you, but just as often the danger is merely getting wet in temperatures below zero, where there is no shelter from the wind and there is often nothing to start a fire with. That is a great danger. A less common danger, but nonetheless very serious, is the moose. The wolves are simply curious. They never cause us any problems. The bears, except for the polar bears, are in hibernation, and most of the polar bears are much further north than where we race. So the only danger for us really is the moose and the buffalo, but we only run through one herd of buffalo on the way to Nome. But the moose, generally, run away from a dog team. But occasionally they will somehow feel entrapped and they feel they have to run towards you and, in essence, through the dog team. That has probably happened to me 3 or 4 times. No serious injuries to the dogs, none to me. Only minor injuries. I was traveling alone at night in the lead of the race and ran into what turned out to be an obviously crazed moose. She was starving to death. There was something wrong with her. She was skin and bones. And rather than run away, she turned to charge the team. Again, I thought she would just run through me. I stopped the team, threw the sled over. She had plenty of room to pass us along the trail. She came into the team and stopped. She just started stomping and kicking the dogs. She charged at me. For 20 minutes, I held her off with my axe and with my parka, waving it in her face. And finally another musher came along and we shot her, but not before she had killed 2 of my dogs and she injured 13 others, leaving me to scratch from the race. She bruised my shoulder. We went and spent the next 2 weeks at a veterinary hospital instead, saving the lives of the injured dogs. So these things are possible, but this is very atypical. Mostly the moose will cause little trouble, but these are some of the dangers that we have to be prepared for. That is definitely the worst thing as far as that it ended with tragedy. However, my close calls, my encounters with open water have been much more severe and have been much closer to death for me and or the team than this was, like for the full team. This one ended very tragically, but I gotta say, I'm a lot more scared of open water than I am of moose today. The most important thing that I believe my job is to train my dogs a trust and be trusted relationship. And this starts with working with the puppies to train them to always trust me, that I will never ask them to go any farther or faster than they're capable of, and yet every day, in some way, I will challenge them, perhaps to go a little bit farther than they know they're capable of doing. However, if they show me that they're not, I'm there to comfort them, to praise them, to give them whatever they need. If they do accomplish it, I'm there to praise them. This I do sometimes just with running the puppies loose, sometimes in the dog team. However it's done, that trust is fairly easy to give to them. The other side they have to learn is that I need to trust in them, that they are smarter in the wilderness than I am, and that I will many times have to depend on their lives and my life in their knowledge. And one of the first ways I found this out was after just 2 years of living in Alaska, and I was traveling on a trail I'd been using all winter long, which crossed a frozen river. And my lead dog, Tekla, at the time, took off to the right. I told her to go back onto the trail. She took off to the right again. And this dog had never disobeyed me, and I could not understand why she was trying to do it. So finally, I gave her her head, and she pulled the team off to the side of the trail just as the trail collapsed into the river, and we all would have drowned. So she had a sixth sense that saved our lives. I do not know the word quit. Either I never did or I have somehow abolished it from my language. If you allowed it to enter your mind, I think during the worst times when you are so exhausted and so cold, and the dogs may be getting tired towards the end of a 4 or 5 hour run, you'd quit. You would. You have to see only that you are going into this specific race, whether it be a 300 or a 500, 1,000 mile race or an individual training run, you are going to complete this. And then if some force such as the moose becomes so great, then it's going to be obvious that you should quit. So you can't think about quit. But I just don't think it even enters my mind. I am always so keyed up for the challenge. And not only in a racing situation where it would be quite obvious, because for the Iditarod I have trained for let alone many years, an entire year for this race. And just because I got a little cold and tired would be a very stupid reason to give up an entire year's work. But even more so, I think the examples that show my lack of willingness to quit would be certain training runs. Runs where I may be out on a 500-mile trip. There is no reason I have to make it from point A to point B. There is nothing driving me but my own desire to get there. And where I'm getting isn't even an important thing to me. It's somehow just to have that challenge. I have been known to walk in front of my team for 55 miles with snowshoes to lead them through snowstorms in non-racing situations where I could have easily just radioed for a plane to come and get me. Instead, I will take the other way out. And it's certainly given my life incredible fulfillment. Because of the lack of sleep, we do get to the point of hallucinations. And I have learned now to take little 15-minute cat naps and how to stay mostly in control of these hallucinations. But my first years of racing, I was horrible. And I had no idea how to sleep. I would usually go for 2 or 3 days without one single nap, and then I'd sleep for 5 hours. So I was not doing it right. And at one point in the race, I was traveling along, and there was 4 of us on the sled, and we each had a job. My job was to lean to the right if the sled would tip to the left. Another person's was to lean to the left if the sled would tip to the right. One person was supposed to use the brake, and I never did figure out what the 4th person was doing on the sled. But here we were going between Ruby, Slatina Crossing and Ruby, over these huge hills, and I was doing a really good job at my job. And every time the sled would lean to the left, I'd lean to the right. But when it would do the other, they weren't doing a good job at all, and we'd tip over. And I would get my face completely full of snow, and you would think that this would wake me up out of this. I would throw the sled back up and yell at these non-existent people, and off we'd go around. I later found out by looking at my watch that this went on for almost 7 hours. The way it stopped was I was going along, and I fell off the sled in my hallucination. And the team was running away from me. There's a rope that drags behind the sled we call the snub line. Well, I grabbed the snub line, and I'm yanking it and yelling them, whoa, 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 and they're disappearing off into the distance. And I finally woke up because I had not a hold of the snub line. Indeed, I had lost the sled, and we have a headlight that we use on our head. There's a cord on it. I had a hold of the cord, and I was yanking my head up and down, yelling, whoa. And I woke up to see my team disappearing into the wilderness, and I said, this is bad. This is not good. Luckily, they were as tired as I was. I told them to whoa. They stopped. I went up there, and we camped, and I slept. But definitely, the hallucinations are pretty hysterical. In one race, Joe Garnier and I were typically neck and neck. We often are. And traveling along in the northern Arctic up by Nome. There is no trees up there. The Arctic tree line is well below us. There are absolutely no trees up there. Well, I was in the lead, and we got off the trail. And I went up to the front of my team, and we were in a thick forest, and I had to lead my dogs through this forest. And Joe came up behind me and said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm leading the team through these trees back to the trail. He said, Susan, there are no trees here. And I said, I know, and I did. I said, but I can't make them go away. And he said, neither can I. And we both were seeing the same trees. We could not make a straight line. We could not make our minds get rid of them and make a straight line to the trail. We weaved our way through these trees back to the trail. So it's quite amazing what exhaustion can do. You know, when I first won the race, I think I was almost in shock. I don't think I could enjoy what had happened until almost 24 hours later. It was, I had worked so hard for it, and of course at this point in the race you are also so exhausted that there was certainly just a glow and a contentment in me. But to actually finally sit back and say, I am the champion of the Iditarod, something that had just been so high and just close enough to almost touch but never touch, and all of a sudden I was there, was amazing to me that I had actually reached a goal. And then I think, as anybody who reaches a goal knows, there's a depression that goes with that. And I had experienced this with every finish of every Iditarod, because that in itself is a goal, just to be able to finish. So I knew a little bit about it, but there was definitely a depression that happened after that. I was quickly able to combat it, probably a week or two after the finish. I just said, well, it's time to get ready for next year's race, and I'm going to go win that one. So I learned that that was the way to battle that problem. And in fact, the next year what I did after winning again was, as I was standing at the finish line and the media wanted to interview me about that race, the 87 race, and asked me how it went, I said, I don't want to talk about this year's race. It's over. I've won it. Let's talk about next year's race. I'm coming back to win it again. And the instant I was done with that goal, I went to my next. And I never went through the depression. My first memories are not of knowing anything about Alaska, but of wanting to live in the wilderness, loving the country, and at that time, at least in my youth, when I was in a city, hating city life, I really didn't get along well with what I saw going on in the cities. I thought it was bad for society. I thought it was unhealthy for the individual humans. I thought it was especially unhealthy for my dog. And so I always knew that I loved country life, and the farther the wilderness, the better. In the first grade, my mother is saved. Those two-liners that you do on those big pieces of paper that said, I hate the city, I love the country. As I got a little bit more sophisticated, they became compositions explaining what was negative about society that had created these cities, and what was positive about country life and how it kept the stress off of people and animals by living in the country. It was really interesting that I would have those thoughts so strongly. I feel that we are born with things that are really innate in us, and I was born with a very strong love for animals and a very strong sense of, from that, you know, animals of course were initially living in the wilderness, so from that, wanting to get back, not so much get back to nature, get back to seeing where our instincts came from, where we came from, what was really going on in man other than what you could be taught in school. I could not find role models that I liked. There were people who were adventurers, who had done wonderful things, but one, they were all men, and not that that kept them from being my role model, but they also were perhaps doing it for different reasons. I couldn't find people that were doing what I wanted to be doing for the reasons I felt I wanted to be doing them. I would state probably someone like Jane Goodall certainly caught my attention, people like that. I was frustrated with the lack of female role models as a child and wondered why I wanted to do many things that at that time weren't very typical for a woman to be doing. And so I think I had to learn at about 15 that I was going to have to set my own path. I really feel I had a strong sense of myself from the earliest memories that I have. I knew very much who I was, approximately what I wanted to do. I didn't know I wanted to be a dog musher. And I feel there are many things in life I could have done and had as much satisfaction as I'm having. But I knew the type of thing that I wanted to do, and I also knew that I wasn't going to let anybody come in the way of that. When I got my second dog, and I was living in my mother's house in Cambridge, and she said, "You will not get a second dog. I won't let you have two dogs in the house." instead of saying, okay, I won't get a second dog, I got my second dog and moved out. So it was always a matter of, and happily, and with a good relationship with my mother. This was not a negative thing towards my mother. This was not something that she even took as it. I was very lucky to have parents that supported my ability to be responsible. I wasn't into drugs. I wasn't a bad child in those ways. It was obvious that I was a workaholic instead, and someone who wanted to live a fairly clean life and not get into that type of trouble. So they could trust that if I wanted to do something, there's a good reason for it. My parents were not thrilled that I didn't go on to college and that I went up to Alaska to mush dogs. I think that, like many parents, they think this is a stage she's going through, so they weren't unsupportive. This is a neat thing to do, Susan, and when are you coming back? And so finally they saw, though, how happy I was up there, how dedicated I was to what I was doing, and that they probably weren't going to see me back down here living. And they often asked me, how did I think I was going to support myself? Because I was just getting more and more broke. I was just going in the hole. I was having a lot of financial trouble. But I never asked for any help financially, and always managed to squeak by, and finally found a way to make a living, becoming really one of the first professional dog mushers ever. That was not something that was going on at the time that I entered the sport. And so it was a matter of believing in what I did and going for it. I went to Colorado State University, took courses, became a veterinary technician, and took courses above and beyond technician work in the veterinary field. But I was not a student, mostly because of my dyslexia, but also because of my love of doing physical things and of being outdoors. And there really was not enough of that. I would have been happy to have gone straight into veterinary school, but they wanted you to take English 1 and History 1 and everything else, and I was too impatient for that. So, but the other thing was, having worked for a vet for 3 years, I adored it. I love veterinary medicine. It's very interesting to me, but I could see it wasn't what I wanted to spend my whole life doing, being inside of a building doing veterinary work. I wanted to be outside. So, yes, I would say there was an overall point in my life that when I moved to Alaska, started dog mushing, I found that it wasn't so much that it brought me such sublime happiness, but total contentment. I was, for the first time in my life, content. And I never missed anything else. I never wished I was doing anything else. There were many unhappy times for me. I lived alone for 9 years. Following my dream, there were some very lonely times. There were some very difficult times. I was often living alone with my closest neighbor 40 miles away. It was tough times for me, but I was never discontented. I was totally content and very, I have to say, happy, despite there may have been some very tough times for me. So there was this point that I remember trying to explain this to my family, which was that I had obviously found something that was right for me. And I can tell you, from the first moment that I landed in the plane in Alaska, I felt at home for the first time in my life. And so there really is something, and I don't want to become mystical about this, but it's something that I don't completely understand, which was really, there was this person born in me that absolutely should have been born in Alaska, or should have been born 50 years before or 100 years before, where I could have been a pioneer. That's all there is to it. I was born with the pioneering spirit. Well, when I went to Alaska, I did love the wilderness. I had spent a lot of time in the country, in Colorado and Maine, in some of eastern Canada, and western Canada. So I thought that I was prepared to go out into bush Alaska with just one other person. I really was not. My survival skills were nowhere what they should have been. However, I learned them the good way. I learned them by trial and error. A friend and myself flew out where the closest town was probably 200 miles away, the closest road 70 miles away, and our closest neighbor 40 miles away. I just took 4 dogs. That's all I could afford to buy. I bought them each for $50 a piece. And some dog food for them, a sack of flour, a slab of bacon, and a jar of peanut butter, and that was it. And this was going to be for 6 months, knowing that this was not enough food, that we were going to have to live off the land. I made a number of ridiculous mistakes. The most typical would be just misjudging the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness and misjudging that there is absolutely no help out there for you if you have any problems. The stupidest was absolutely the day we were flown in the little single-engine plane. The pilot dumped me and the dogs. It was a plane on skis. The lake was frozen. Out on the lake and flew away. And I had only owned the dogs. They were little 4-month-old puppies for about a week. And individually, they were really good at being let loose and coming to me. I was learning to train them, just my necessary obedience commands. So I let all 4 of them loose. I thought this was a great idea. And I started toting the things over to the small log cabin that was going to be our home. And pretty soon I looked up and no dogs around. Well, I was wearing, because I was doing so much work carrying all this stuff over to the 1/4 mile to the cabin, that I was down to a light sweater and a turtleneck, cotton turtleneck underneath. I suspect I had long underwear on, no hat, no mittens. And this was late November. In Alaska, you can get 50 and 60 below at that time of year. We were probably at about 0 or 10 below during the day. So I decided I'm going to take off. I didn't even tell my friend where I was going to. I mean, I thought I was going to go around the bend and find the dogs. And I went off calling their names and whistling and everything else, following their footprints. Well, around dusk, I had not found them. I was 2 mountain valleys over from where I was. I was starting to get really cold. The temperature was dropping phenomenally. It was probably at least 30 below. And I was getting seriously cold and really worried about the dogs, and was kind of coming to the point of, do I follow, continue and find them, or do I go back, but it's really dark, and can I even find my way back? And realizing I have made a really serious judgment call. So what I did was I brought the sweater up around my head and over my arms. Luckily it was a large sweater, and kind of got into that and just said, I think perhaps as long as I can find the dogs in a reasonable time, that is my only out, because they can find our way back to the lake. And luckily I only went about another half hour in, by that time, what was really getting to be dark, before the first one came to me and shortly after the others. They had stayed in a pack. I could tell they were chasing moose tracks. And that was my worry, as I was having trouble telling the difference between animal tracks at this point in the dusk and dogs' tracks. Well, I found the dogs, and being terrified of them running off again, I took off my turtleneck and left just my sweater on and used the turtleneck as a leash for 2. Now, I was mistaken in that, because they were as excited to see me as I was them. They were 4-month-old puppies, and they said, "Where have you been?" So we were all happy to be reunited. And luckily, though, the extra physical effort that I had to do to hold 2 dogs on a leash and to quickly follow them at a dog's pace back to the lake kept me very heated, and I made it back. But this was a stupid error, and could have turned out as badly as I have seen many chichacos go. Many people who first come to the state have froze to death 100 yards from a cabin, making very stupid decisions and basically thinking that they're tougher than they are. And so these were the type of challenges that I had, learning the Eskimo and Indian cultures. It was a very new culture, but this was the first time I felt at home. I felt at home with the people, I felt at home with the country, and so none of this was really fearful to me. I learned these lessons. I learned to have a very educated respect for nature and a certain type of a fear, but not, I was never scared of what I was going forward into. And I became a little bit more and more cautious as the time went on. I'm still not cautious enough. I am definitely one of those people who is a risk taker, and it seems to be just part of my life. There were also, when I moved to Alaska, having grown up in the city and having disliked the city and therefore disliked mass amounts of people, not individual people, but large groups of people, I felt that I could do without people, because this would be the other extreme. And after living at one point for 4 months alone at this cabin in the wilderness without my friend, I realized that no, I did indeed need people. So this was a new revelation for me. But yet I continued to live alone, often with closer neighbors than that. But there were definitely some lonely years. The economic problem was amazing. I was 20 years old when I went up there. My first job, I would get a summer job and make between $600 and $1,000 during the summer, and that had to support me and my dogs for the winter. Well, luckily in the beginning I only had 4. Finally I had 11, and I was living mostly off the land. I was eating moose myself, and the dogs I was making a mixture of cornmeal and rabbit and whatever I could get. So I did have very few expenses. Most of the jobs that I did get would be room and board in addition to some small fee, and I could usually work a deal where it was room and board for me and my dogs. And because there's so much fish and native foods available to be able to feed a dog team, which does not have to come from someone's pocket. So I made it through the early years until I started racing. When I started racing, that is just a huge expense. The added high nutrition you have to be feeding them, the added equipment that you need. Before that, I had just built all my own sleds. They weren't good, but they worked. I I'd had time to do these extra things, and 2, I didn't need as good equipment. Now, all of a sudden, I needed to buy harnesses. I needed to buy sleds. And so my first race, I went about $5,000 in debt. And luckily, it was just to, say, $500 to the sled builder and so on and so forth. And they were wonderful people and lended me the credit with no exact time as to whether it was due back. And so I would finish the race, win some prize money, pay them back as good as I could. And then I started going into the salmon industry. And I would work what we call 7/18, 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. And this is very typical of our fish industry up there. You can make huge amount of money in a short season by working long hours, either in the canneries or fishing yourself or whatever. And for 5 years, I worked all sorts of jobs in the salmon industry, making very decent money. So I could usually bring myself up to close to zero in my bank balance, getting ready to go into the next racing season to spend $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 preparing for the race. There was not one single moment that told me I wanted to become a professional dog musher. Again, it was more a thing that throughout my life I knew I would be working with animals, I knew I would be especially working with dogs, and I knew I would be living in the wilderness. When dog mushing came along for me, yes, there's a story that put it into my life, which was that I just chose a Siberian Husky as a pet dog. I went to pick it up from the people. They said, oh, the mother was an Alaskan sled dog, and she was actually a leader. Wouldn't it be fun if you taught your puppy how to pull a sled? And that was really what put the idea in my head. From there, I went on to being enthralled with it. And the first time I read about the Iditarod, which was the first year it happened, I just said, I'm going up there to run that race. Again, even at that point, I certainly didn't know that I would be doing it 14 years later. Had the Iditarod not been happening, I would have just been dog mushing throughout Alaska and doing adventures using the dogs. because the Iditarod race was started by a man named Joe Reddington Sr., and it was his idea, this gave me a great vehicle to jump into to be able to make a livelihood through the prize money, through the sponsorships, through the dog sales, that I wouldn't have had a race like the Iditarod not been available to me. It never did occur to me that this was something a woman shouldn't do. There were no competitive women racing at that time in long-distance racing. There were 3 women who had completed the Iditarod. We have 60 to 70 mushers every year, and more than half of them go on a camping trip to complete the course. And there were 3 women who had completed it by the time I started. And I had a very different idea and wanted to go in there competitively because I have a very strong competitive nature. And I think I was astounded and very unhappy my first year when I found that there was some resistance from my fellow mushers because I was a woman. And but what I did was basically to ignore it and to just go forward. And it wasn't until about 6 or 7 years later, having fought the problems and some of the prejudices that were very strongly there and knocking me in the face, and I was just refusing to look at them, that I was speaking with a woman and saying, I'm so tired of certain things, and explaining them to her. And she said, don't you understand that by going and breaking trail and setting certain standards that you are bound to butt into these things, and it is harder for you to do it. And I had never even thought of that before. I did not specifically seek out to be a pioneer for women. To me, I was always very aware that I was a woman, and I was very aware that I was the only woman being competitive. But I also saw it as that I was a human being, and that's how I wanted to be accepted. And I didn't see why people couldn't accept that right away. So it wasn't until I became accepted, as well as I have now, that I realized the struggle that I did go through. To be a dog musher, what we call recreational mushers, it's not a big deal. There's thousands of them all over the world, but just tens of thousands in Alaska that have a few dogs. That could be anything from 3 to 12 to 20 dogs in essence in your backyard that are fed food as good or better, but not an expensive feed as somebody's pet dog, so it's not a huge expense. They're often fed fish that people can get right out of the streams in Alaska, so it can be to no expense. And so it really just takes time, and if you don't want to go 1,000 miles in March like we do, you don't have to put a lot of training into it. You can use them for your enjoyment or when you want to travel, and they don't have to be heavily trained because they're such incredible animals. So to be a recreational musher, depending on the amount of energy you want to put in, that's all it is. That's the only thing that, the only guidelines that you have, and of course that you take good care of them and everything else. But to be a racer is a totally different thing. The competition is extremely fierce, getting fiercer every year, and so you have to well, one, you have to have more dogs. You have to have, in essence, a bench. So if you're going to need 20 dogs for the team, you have to have, say, at least 30 because you have to have some reserves. If you're going to buy them all, you only have to own perhaps 30. If you're going to raise them all like I do, you have to own somewhere around 100. So then you just are quadrupling the formula. And the most important then is the care that you are giving these dogs. They are no longer dogs. They are professional athletes. And so they need all the sports medicine in addition to the regular veterinary medicine. They need the best nutrition possible. They need training on a daily basis from the age of 1 or 2 days old till the time that you retire them. So it's a totally different story between racing and recreational mushing. Well, my relationship is extremely close. I have often described it as that they are my friends, my family, and my workmates. And so they get my attention round the clock. They are of total importance to me because certainly during those years that I lived alone, they were often my only friends. Now I have my husband and a few young people working for me, but they are still often my closest friends. And then they are my livelihood. And we work together as a team on a daily basis. And I train 12 to 16 hours a day, usually 7 days a week. And only when I'm away, perhaps 30 days a year, am I ever off of that schedule. So I'm really spending all of my time with these dogs. And I raise them all from puppies, so they are my family. They are very much like children. I'm going to tell you now what it is taking me to be able to win the Iditarod here in the early 90s. And that means I have to train at least 11 and a half months a year. And this is basically 7 days a week. I am training myself through running, cycling, a weightlifting program, and then for about 9 months of the year, 8 to 9 months of the year, I'm on a sled and I'm mushing 50 to 70 miles a day. And then in addition to caring for the dogs and hauling the water from the creek, we still don't have running water and heating with wood and stuff. My lifestyle is keeping me fit. As far as the dogs go, from the time that the dogs are 4 months of age, they go in harness, pulling either a sled in the wintertime or a four-wheeled cart in the summertime, 3 to 4 times a week for the rest of their lives. So each dog in my kennel needs to go 3 to 4 times a week. As puppies, say 2 to 10 miles, and as they advance, from 10 to 90 miles a day. And so that is my job, to take maybe 2, 3, 4, up to 10 teams out a day, depending on the length that I'm going to be running them. And during this process, I am physically conditioning them, I am mentally training them, and I am educating them. And all are equally important, and all are very exciting. And because I am at the leading edge of my sport. Now, dog mushing is a very old lifestyle, but dog sled racing is a relatively new sport, really just 20 years old. So advances are being made very rapidly, and there are no books to read. We cannot find out what the next move is. So that is one of the things that keeps it so exciting for me, is that I'm always having to figure out new conditioning methods, new training methods to educate the dogs. And then probably foremost interest and importance to me would be the mental training, the trust that I develop with them, the winning spirit that I enhance in them and bring forward. And so I am really looking for the mental athlete when I pick my pups. I do not always pick the best physical specimen if it doesn't have that extra athletic heart. My first year, I came in the money. I was the first woman to do so. And so media attention, of course, turned to me quite rapidly. And everybody kind of turned to take note. But it was all kind of thought I didn't do that well, that it was allowable. Here's a freak. Look at her. She did this. The next year, I advanced rapidly and was in the top 10. And immediately hackles started coming up on the back of the neck. I started getting a very different reception. But they weren't discounting me yet. That didn't happen until the next year when I was in the top 5. And then immediately, many of my fellow mushers were saying she was lucky, it was an easy year. There was always some sort of excuse for the reason that I was doing well. In addition, I ran into all sorts of really harsh criticism, verbally to my face, sometimes even physical acts that made it twice as difficult for me to continue down the trail in the manner that I should be able to compared to what they would do with a fellow musher. The next year, when I continued to do as well, and the following years, I met with opposition in that many of the male mushers formed a group against me and worked as a group against me, strategically planning their strategies to ruin my strategy for the race. And it was somewhere in there that I saw that in order for me to win the race, I had to be much better than they were. I didn't have to be just a little bit better than the best male. He could win being just a little bit better, and they just weren't gonna let me win being that much better. So it was then that I said, well, then I take that challenge and I will become that much better, and I can become that much better, and I think I know how. And I started working on it, and it did come true. Because I had to do that and I had to work so hard on it, it wasn't something that was going to happen easily. I have to count here. Okay, so it wasn't until my 8th race that I won. And so then, yes, I think there perhaps was starting to be an inkling of self-doubt. I knew I could win. And I had great faith, or of course I never could have finally pulled it all together. But when the papers would say, and my fellow mushers would say, she'll never be able to win because of such and such, you know, this does work on you mentally. And you combat it and you say it's not true, but to constantly hear it, it's very difficult. And then the other thing is individually, all these men that I speak of that jointly would often be against me were individually my good friends. And so that was very painful, to have good friends be fine the rest of the year and treat you as a friend, and yet when they would get into a racing situation and get in this buddy system, I was out. I wasn't even welcome to share the campfires with them. So it was tough. There was a real loneliness in it for me. I think by the time I had won my first race, there was no doubt in anybody's mind my ability or my dog's ability. And I think I do have the respect. I, in some ways, I really don't blame anybody for the problems. We all have to grow. And as I had to make the move into becoming a woman very dominant in the sport, it was a long growing process for me. It was also a growing process that all the men had to go through too. So I have never found fault with any individual for the problems that they had dealing with me entering the sport. The respect came, and they really do have great respect for my ability. What I also don't blame them for is, of course, the media has made a big thing of it. And that is difficult for them, it's difficult for me. But I feel very sorry for some of my fellow mushers how that has been handled in the media. And so that is the only ongoing conflict at this point. So this has happened to me at least well over 1,000 times, so I know that it really happens. When we're mushing along in the race with this lack of sleep, you do that thing that everybody has experienced while driving, where you're kind of doing this and you're not even sure how long you've been asleep or awake for. With the dog mushing on a fairly good trail, you might even have been asleep a minute or 2 minutes or 2 seconds. But at any rate, your eyes are shut and you are asleep. And the trails are not brushed back well. There are often trees and things in the way that could hit you at any length. And I can be asleep, eyes shut, and a radar, is all I can call it, will spot the tree that is about to hit me. And I do not wake up in time to see it and duck. I duck before I'm really awake, turn around, and I have just missed a branch. And it has happened literally thousands of times. So this is something that I have never experienced before, that you can come in contact with things that we lose by using all the technology. So there's a gain and a loss to the technology. So it isn't that I think that everyone should live in the wilderness, but I do think to have experienced a little bit of it does give people a closer understanding of some of their own human nature that is otherwise difficult for them to understand the emotions that they're going through. On top of that, country living and wilderness living keeps you much closer to death. You see death in animals much more often. You see death in humans more often. We do have a lot of tragic drownings, people freezing to death, and various violent things, not crimes, but things that are happening out there. So you do experience dead bodies of humans, of dogs, of wildlife, of everything. Death becomes much closer to you as a part of life. I think that is often something that the sterileness of some cities, at any rate, take away from you. The bodies are whisked away. You don't see this. And this is a part of life, and I think a very good part of life, and something that we shouldn't have as much fear of. And the other aspect comes to the environment, which is to see the gross and obvious mismanagement that everybody knows that man is doing, but to not experience it on a daily basis, it is often misunderstood where this mismanagement is happening. And we tend to be extremists. We fish heavily in one area and then say, oh my God, the fish are all leaving this area. We should never fish it again. Both of these were massive mismanagement. A compromise is usually the better management. The same with any man has come on this earth, and we do hunt animals, we do fish the fish out of the ocean, and we have disturbed nature in every far distant point of this land, whether man has ever walked on it or not. Therefore, to have one time gone in and shot a bunch of wolves and now say never shoot a wolf again, we are not managing nature correctly, because if the wolves get too plentiful, they kill off all the moose, or they all die of starvation, and it is still man's fault. So we have to manage, and it's a compromise. And I think, again, being in nature gives you much closer knowledge of, perhaps you don't have all the right answers, because this takes a lot of study, but you can see that a balance is what is necessary. That is what Mother Nature put on Earth, which was an incredibly beautiful balance. We have imbalanced it. We have to rebalance it. We have a huge responsibility, absolutely. And to just, and you know, many people are appalled or fearful of the aggressive response, which is to perhaps have to hunt or kill some moose in some areas, or some wolves, or some rats, or some anything that has overgrown. People have said no to all death, no to all destruction. And this is what I say about death. The lion eats the antelope. The seal eats the fish. This is the food chain. This is natural. This is okay. Death is okay. Killing is okay if it is done for the correct purposes. Killing for trophy hunting is not, in my mind, okay. But for management of nature, this is something that we do have a responsibility for. And to just say, no, let's leave it back in the hands of Mother Nature, let's throw all her animals back to her, never kill another animal, we are doing a disservice to all of them. Do we want certain ones to die off, some to die of disease or famine, because we have already gone in and ruined their habitat? This is unfair in my mind. So I would rather see the short-term suffering than the long-term suffering. Before I won my first Iditarod, I was trying very hard to do so. And I had a very fast team, well-conditioned and well-trained. but I kept coming in second in more races than I care to remember. And clearly some essential element was missing. I feel it was the winning spirit and vision. And I would often finish in a race an hour or a minute or a split second behind someone else, but I'd have had the strongest and fastest team. So in 1986, I learned how to pull it all together. I told myself that not only could I win, but that I deserved to win, and that I could win today. I knew before that I someday would win the Iditarod, but I didn't see myself as a winner today, so I often kept failing. In 1986, I lived and breathed the vision of winning the Iditarod for the full year. And I held it 11 days into the Iditarod, where I was neck and neck with Joe Garney, 44 miles from the finish line. I had had less than 20 hours of sleep in 11 days. I had run up every hill between Anchorage and Nome. But Joe made a final push and passed me, gaining a 2-minute lead. And I was exhausted and demoralized and said to myself, well, I guess second place isn't too bad. But then through the blur of fatigue, I again remembered the vision of myself winning the 1986 Iditarod, and I knew this race could be mine alone. And so for the next 44 miles, I ran, pumped with one leg, or pushed until I passed Joe and won my first Iditarod. And I feel this same vision has seen me through many races, but clearly not all of them. It takes a lot more than vision. In this most recent race in 1991, I finished the worst I have done since 1983 in any race of any distance. I finished third, despite the fact that I trained myself and my team better than I have ever done before, despite turning over every leaf in my preparations. I lost. I was said to have the best team in the history of the Iditarod. And because of this, I ran a very aggressive race. But Mother Nature threw every curve at me and my team that she could. I ended up breaking trail for almost 500 miles through windstorms, through new snow on the trail, and not physically exhausting my dogs, but mentally exhausting my dogs. We were constantly searching for the trail, giving them the commands for right and left. It's a tough job to break trail for the rest of the teams. So I still reached the village of White Mountain over 1 hour in front of my closest competitor, and this is 77 miles from Nome. From there, I went first into the eye of an Arctic blizzard, and I struggled for 6 hours, losing and regaining the trail, until finally, because of the trust I have developed in my dogs, I knew that I could not ask them for any more. So I lost. I feel that because I challenge myself so often, sometimes I will fail. This is, to me, the essence of competition, that there will be both winners and losers. But I have great faith in myself that I will turn this loss into something positive. First, there are many lessons to be learned, and I think one of my favorite lessons is best summed up in the words of an old Athabaskan Indian who told me, there are many hard things in life, but there is only one sad thing, and that is giving up. In addition, I feel that in failure, it is just another step at attaining my final goal. My goal was not to win the 1991 Iditarod only. My goal is to become the best long-distance sled dog racer in the world. And really, failures, if anything, can be turned around into being one of the best things that happen to you in life. As tragic as the loss of my dogs by the moose was for me, it certainly was a turning point where I had to look at what I was doing and say, this has brought me more pain than I have ever had to feel before. Having put my beloved dogs in a situation where 2 of them were killed, mourning the loss of them. Did I really want to run the Iditarod again? And was it worth putting myself in these positions and not winning. And to have to come to the realization that yes, with the hundreds of thousands of miles I had mushed, the fact that this had only happened once, this was not going to be a common occurrence and has never happened again, it really taught me a new dedication to what I was doing. And I think out of this failure in 1991, I will again gain a new dedication, one more step up the ladder, not perhaps just to running the Iditarod, but to perhaps the next step in my life. And so it's often the failures that you learn more from than you do the wins or reaching one's goals. I have many years of racing left in me, but I also want to raise a family. And I'm 36 years old at this time, so it's important that soon I start my family. But I can race afterwards, a little bit during the early years of rearing children. But in addition, I am getting more and more interested in the research and development of where the sport of sled dog racing is going, where the care of canines and felines and all pets in general is, the education of the public as to how they should be caring for their pets, and the education of the public as to what we should be doing with nature and with the wildlife in particular. So these are areas that I'm very interested in. However, I will never leave my lifestyle of dog mushing. That is inherent to me now, and that will always be the main basis of what makes up my daily satisfaction, my daily contentment with life. The most wonderful one is that the weather, what Mother Nature is doing, dictates your entire life. And this is so much a part of my life, I don't understand it not being. And because I often have commitments to somebody on the outside world, I find that the rest of the world is not like that. And when they ask me to come and do a speaking engagement on March the 30th at 3 o'clock, they rarely understand when I say I'll be there weather permitting. And I really am not saying that I won't give it my absolute all to get there, but sometimes you merely cannot get out of there. You can't get a helicopter, you can't get a plane. No amount of money can move me from the spot that I may be in. And in fact, the best method out of there is dog team. But that's going to be slow and sure. And if I've got 180 miles to go, I'm not going to be able to do it in the hour that they need me to rush off and get down to California or something. So that, I think, is great. Your life, your daily life is dictated by what the weather is doing. Your sense that you have to rely completely on yourself, that there are no people to turn to, is an incredibly satisfying feeling. And once you become content with it, I think that people would find that they have a whole lot more self-esteem and self-confidence that is built by knowing that you can depend on yourself and not on somebody else. And then perhaps as you learn to depend on people for certain things, as I am depending on more and more people, my husband and many other people in my life now, more than I used to, I still have all that initial self-confidence, which is that they could disappear and I'm still fine. And as much as I wouldn't like it, I'm still fine. And that sense is really a wonderful sense. And so I think that's a lot of what Eureka brings to me. The lack of television, the lack of outside stimulus is really the main thing that people should experience sometime in their lives. Because I often find I have such a sense of well-being and understanding of what is going on in my life. And if there's something tragic going on, I will be very depressed, very unhappy. But there is the cause. There's cause and effect out there. Whereas I've often gone into Anchorage and had lunch with a friend of mine who is just feeling dragged down, doesn't really know why. And yet, during the lunch, she has told me about a motorcyclist who came by in the morning when she was driving to work and gave her the finger. You know, the bus driver who wouldn't give her the correct change and all this stuff. Well, this is depressing. But yet, people tend to think this is just part of life. I'm supposed to take it. I'm a career woman. I'm going off to work. And, you know, my husband and I are getting along and my career's moving along. So why am I depressed? These things are depressing. Or they watched the news. Or they watched some horrible horror movie at night. These things affect us greatly, and people don't give them credit. And if they could get away from them for a while, I'm not saying that they should be negated from people's lives, but they could learn how much effect these have on their daily life. And I enjoy the lack of that type of effect. I feel very fortunate that from a very early age, I knew what I wanted to do. And I know that many people of 18, 24, 30 years old still have not really reached a passion the way I had a passion at a very young age. But whenever you do find something, maybe it's not as passionate for you as dog mushing has been for me, but the fact that you have any interest, that is what you should go with. And particularly if you have a passion, no matter how many people criticize that passion, no matter if you cannot see the link between how what you're going to do is going to benefit others, I can promise you if you do anything well, it will benefit others. So you have to go with your dream, which is certainly what I have done, which has brought my life great fulfillment. I have ended up being able to be a role model for other people and to be very helpful for a lot of people. Something that when I initially saw dog mushing, I did not see how it could benefit other people. But in the end, I will work it so it can give as much benefit to my career, my life, to as many other people as I can affect. So I think I do believe in luck. A lot has been said that there's luck here and there, but I believe that you make your own luck. Those that are best prepared have the best luck. And it's just merely to educate yourself well. Just keep your eyes open. It isn't maybe that you need a PhD. I did not end up going and finishing college. I took a lot of courses. I am learning as much today as I learned when I left high school. I have my eyes open constantly. I take courses. I read books. So I'm always there so that if something happens, my mind's ready to absorb it, take advantage of it, make my own luck. So everybody makes their own luck. There is bad luck. There is good luck. But mostly to just be prepared and keep your mind open. You'll be ready for anything that comes along. It does take hard work and dedication to reach anything. And if it doesn't, if you do fall into something that is just pure luck, you will never have the same type of satisfaction as something that you really feel that you had to work for and achieve and got. And so I think it's important to find something that is a really hard challenge for yourself. And when you reach the age of 50, you will not feel that you should have done something better with your life. Even if you're a millionaire or a billionaire, you may be an unsatisfied one. And that is something that only time can tell. Each of us has to go through that really and experience it. But that has certainly been my experience in life, which is the more work I've put into any individual accomplishment, the more I've gotten out of it. And then I mentioned this morning too. Because some young people don't have as strong of passions as I did, and because even with the strong passions that I had, I did not know whether I was going to be a solo around-the-world sailor. I did not know if I was going to be a dog musher or a farmer with a bunch of cows. I didn't know exactly where my passion was going to lead me. Open yourself for all of the challenges that come along, and don't worry too much about each decision that comes along in your life. You don't have to make the perfect decision. I do not feel that dog mushing was the only thing that could have brought me as much joy as I get now. I feel that I could have gone into many different fields and been just as happy as I am now. I never belabored, is that it? I never belabored any one decision too much, because if you do, you often miss the opportunity. So if opportunity rings, if it sounds interesting, whether it's to go to a special school or to go on some adventure, just do it. If it sounds good, just do it, especially when you're young. That's the time to do it. Get out there, experience as many different things as you can. And I really believe that a lot of them should be outside of the formal education field. I feel that there's a lot that college can teach you, but I think that there's a lot to be learned in the real world. And better to learn it early than to wait till you're 24 and all of a sudden step out into the real world and say, now what? A year off of college, somewhere in between, won't hurt at all. When I was still in Massachusetts and had just vaguely gotten an inkling towards dog mushing in the wilderness, I read a story about the Eskimos up in the Northwest Territory. And I was really thrilled with their lifestyle. And the Eskimos in Alaska were a lot what drew me there. And it's still one of my passions today, is understanding their culture and how they live and how they're dealing with being thrown into the 20th century so rapidly in just 4 generations. I've read Jack London and I loved him. And now, today, there are so many differences that I know between what he wrote about and what is the norm in dog mushing that I see. I still love his stories as much as I ever did, but I also see discrepancies between what he wrote about, the romantic stories that he told, and the reality of, you know, he often had vicious dogs. The dogs are actually totally docile, wonderful pets. And so I often find myself having to re-educate the public from what they learned from Jack London. But other than that, I adore him.